Hello, this is Aaron Wissner of Local Future. I am live on the line to Ireland with David Korowicz. David is a physicist and humans systems ecologist. He has a background in understanding large-scale societal risks and preparedness. And for those of you who haven't seen David before, David, could you just tell us a little bit about your most recent hired work? I believe you were working, was it in Sweden or Switzerland on something? Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, the last thing was I was Director of Risk and Response at the Geneva Global Initiative. And though based in Switzerland, it had a global view of how that we are sort of dealing with the world of converging risks that interact through increasingly vulnerable societal systems like supply chains and financial systems, and that we need to prepare for that eventuality. So very much it was prefiguring things like COVID, climate change, financial shocks, cyber attacks on grids, a myriad of things, and sort of saying we're in a new risk environment. We need an integrated way of viewing it. What do we do? And that's what my job was about saying on the theory side is what's the problem? How do we respond? And then the communication side was sort of saying, how do we build an international community of allies and others who are open to these sort of ideas so that we can start plotting paths through which we could better prepare. So that was it. Hello, have you frozen? Okay, there's been a freeze. I don't know. Aaron? There's been a freeze. So I don't know if I'm going out into the world. If I am, my apologies. F-O-R-O-Z-E-N. Oh boy. Hello, Aaron.
David.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there, but
no, that was my fault. So in my household, in order to connect to the internet, we connect through a cell phone using a wireless hotspot. And my wife has one and I have one. And this particular computer was attached to my wife's hotspot.
Okay.
And she just left.
Okay.
With her phone.
Okay.
And then since my phone had not been connected to anybody, it turned itself off as a wireless hotspot. So I had to run up.
No problem at all. So I leave it back to your hands and
okay. So we missed the latter half of your answer about what you were doing in Switzerland. So could you just repeat that part?
Okay, well, I was working to sort of help societies, governments, and other parties like contingency agencies, etc., rethink risk. We're living in we need an integrated view for emerging systemic risk, and also saying, how do we respond as a society? Where are the scope for actions? Where are actions limited? and sort of trying to find positive ways of really building a platform through which states could think and start to practice preparing for an increasingly high risk and uncertain future. So that's what I was doing until the end of last year. And since then, I've been doing various things back here in Ireland, but all roundabout risk and coronavirus and its myriad consequences.
I'm curious, what nations would you say are most mindful or most well prepared for risks in the future versus which ones least prepared?
Well, here's the thing. It's an interesting question because there's not one set of answers. If you look at countries that have done particularly well on suppressing the virus so far, because we're still in a process. So ultimately, these things will be judged over a few years. I think that's important to say. But countries like Taiwan, Singapore, and others did pretty well. They got their testing very quickly. There was it was also quite a bit of what we would see as social control in some of them in Taiwan, but it was open and it was high trust society, etc. So these sort of, the Asian countries, Taiwan, Korea, were more, they had a good response, but they were also more attuned to risks of pandemics, merely because they knew they were most likely to be closer to a pandemic if it emerged. Because of our experience in that whole region from MERS, SARS, etc. It was thought in the broad sense that was the region where that would be the epicenter, or at least the kickoff point. So they were pretty good. If you looked on paper a year ago and said, who is prepared, maybe not just for pandemics, but for big shocks, big hits, one would have looked at the United States and one would have looked at the UK, for example. Both have big contingency infrastructure. They run big exercises. There is, has been a culture of preparedness to some degree, so that when, for example, the supermarkets started to flag warning signs that supermarket shelves might be emptying, etc., they responded pretty well in the UK. And part of that was big companies like Tesco had run exercises for pandemics and for other big eventualities. So that's sort of
Tesco?
Tesco is a big supermarket chain. Actually, it's a big global supermarket chain now. So that if you're, that really helps. So it's not just about the government being prepared, it's about spreading that out so that, Tesco, it's not that you're prepared and you're doing an exercise for what you think is exactly what will happen, but it trains you to think in emergency terms and what are the critical things, etc. So all of that has a benefit. However, we'll see that, we've mentioned sort of Germany has done pretty well without kicking up a fuss, New Zealand, etc. So, but what we see, of course, with the US on paper and the UK on paper, they haven't done well at all. They've been pretty appalling, which is that point of you can have great preparedness, but you need something more than just having a load of emergency contingency planners and military people and others who've been doing all this work in the background in some countries. You need leadership, number one. You need a level of social trust. the public, because you're asking public, you can't police, unless you're a very totalitarian state, you can't police what everybody's doing. You're saying to people, do social distancing, etc., etc. That requires that people are going to largely cooperate with those sort of directives. So, you've got to feel that, well, the government is doing it and saying these things for us, for all of us. It's a thing we do for our neighbors and our country, and that there's, there's a general feeling that government is competent, government is looking out for us, and therefore we will give that sort of trust. Actually, I think in Taiwan, the mobile tracking stuff was pretty intrusive, what we would see as very intrusive. But there's high social trust. They were open about discussing it. It wasn't the scarier Chinese version, which is more coercive, top down. This was different, but still, it was intrusive. So you can see sort of in preparedness, you can have great planning, as though most of those countries did. If your politics fails, or if your social trust fails, your planning won't get you very far, or it'll be undermined. Now, if you go to poorer countries, I think this is also an interesting question, that some of the countries that had to, Sierra Leone and others, that had to deal with Ebola, a shockingly, I can't hear you.
Which we call Ebola in the US.
Ebola. Pretty shocking disease. They learned from that. So when they were triggering that a new disease was emerging, they responded quickly, they responded effectively in many cases. So, and the political wherewithal was there to sort of say, okay, everybody, we've got a new problem, and we've got to work on this. So that side is, it's not just about rich countries, it's poorer countries can do just as well or better. But a lot of it really does seem to come down to, yes, preparedness is great, but how societies work together, what we call politics, but it's really broader than that. It's the social contract has to work in some way as well.
What you are saying brings up a couple thoughts as far as preparedness. This morning I was reading an article written about China and the United States. And in particular, it was talking about electromagnetic pulse as a weapon, EMP, which is something that's kind of popular in science fiction film and even kind of sciencey film. The idea of the article was that the US in particular demonstrated a lack of preparedness as far as pandemics go, an inability to respond effectively as a nation to this pandemic, which most people would say it's not even a very severe pandemic. And when the death rate is only around 1% of the population, it doesn't compare to what a pandemic might be.
Sure.
And so the fact that the US has been able to respond and doesn't seem to have a plan, even though in the fall, supposedly there was this whole pandemic simulation that was run in the US. And so this article went on to say, be far ahead of us regarding developing weapons, that the EMP weapon could, if detonated high enough over the central US, it could fry, much of the electronic infrastructure of the center of the country, if not most of the country. And that this is something that it's probably likely that the US isn't really prepared for. Because if they aren't even prepared for something like a pandemic, which is something we've known about, then how likely that they're really prepared with hardened structures, you know, computers and whatnot for that sort of thing. And then it went on to talk about how the US military, which I less, how its Navy is sending ships into the South China Sea near to China, which China views as their own territorial waters. And the US says, no, your territorial waters are only 10 miles offshore or something. But then the China suggesting that, well, perhaps perhaps detonating an EMP near to these neighbors, take them out to fry their electronics without necessarily killing anyone directly, that this might be a reasonable response. So I think this goes back to the idea of that you're touching on as far as preparedness and what sort of you know, what are the things that make for a group of people, no matter how large or no matter how well prepared?
Okay, sorry, Aaron, one moment. I don't know if this is going out, but your sound is breaking up a little bit.
Okay. Were you able to hear what I said?
I was able to hear, but just notifying you.
Thank you. Thank you for notifying me right away.
I think the first thing is, I think the US has been aware of EMP risks. There was a report in, I think, 2007-8, which was a follow-on report from 2004. There was another one in a presidential commission report in 2018. So it's been on the radar. And there has been an awareness. Organizations like the Electric Infrastructure Security Council have been promoting that awareness, saying, you know, the United States and indeed the world needs to be better prepared. And I understand efforts have been made in terms of preparedness and hardening parts of the system. And those concerns for the grid have also been tied into concerns about a very severe and successful persistent cyber attack on the grid if you were able to find a way of both taking it down and stopping it getting back up again. So the engineers in some way were hindered from it. And the third part, worry about the grid, is a severe solar storm. That basically what you have in the Aurora Borealis, but there is such an injection, it kind of goes right down and starts, yeah, well, put it colloquially, frying the grid. So these bunch of concerns around the grid have been growing in importance, and it's very easy to see why. If you lose your grid, you know, you lose your water, because that's what pumps it around. If you live in a city, you'll find your human waste coming up through your toilets. Your lift won't work, your bank card won't work, your business won't open, your phone won't work, you know, basically the whole gamut of things. You lose all sorts of things. And the economy stops. So you can see why it's a major systemic risk. And I know for the electromagnetic pulse, the main thing they've been worried about was, say, transformers in power stations, that they get fried. Now, the thing about transformers, if you do an internet search for electric transformer, you might see a big, huge ship with two big, ginormous things on it. And they are transformers, they are massive. And the kind of one of the problems for transformers is, I think there's only 2 companies in the world that make them, something very small. they take a long time. They have a long lead time because transformers are the big thing that you have in a power station, but power and critical infrastructure tends to be pretty predictable. In other words, you know when you've got to do repairs, you know when the lifetime of the thing is over, you know if you're building a new power station, because it takes so long to build, that the supply chain is pretty boring, if you know what I mean. It's not designed for fluctuation, and these are huge things. You can't build, or you can't reach, like we saw that it doesn't have a surge capacity. Now we saw in the coronavirus with medical visors and masks that there was a lack of surge capacity, but they're relatively low complexity goods, those sort of masks and all of that. So you can repurpose other equipment. You can set up a production line relatively easy. Not super easy, but relatively easy. And you can build relatively quickly a surge capacity. You can't do that with electric transformers. They're altogether in a different realm. So the problem for the EMP attack, but it could also be a solar storm, is that if you fry your electric transformers, you can't fix them. You can't go to anywhere and just say, well, we need to replace half of our country's transformers. Can't be done. They're not there. They're not in the system. And the problem really then is, well, you can imagine Northeast United States loses its power. Well, if that happens and you can't replace all the transformers in time, you're going to have a shock that's going to keep spreading around the world, and it may end up affecting the companies that make the transformers, because you're destroying financial systems, you're destroying supply chains and all of that. So it could be.
David, are you implying that side of the U.S. is critical to the global economy?
This is a question that Lorraine Hussey asked after one of our, and I'll come back to it because it's kind of connected. This was the problem about the fears of an EMP attack. In the first instance, it seems, well, you know what, if an EMP attack happened now, well, if we were standing out in the field, obviously, if we lose our electricity now, we'll know straight away. But if we were standing out in the field, we wouldn't notice it. You know what I mean? Well, we might notice the explosion, but not, but if it's high up, low radiation, but it does the frying part, and we wouldn't really notice it. So you lose the electricity in a long distance away, but that links to water, food security, everything else. So, it would be deadly. And in a Senate or congressional report, where they were discussing one of the EMP reports over a decade ago, and I think somebody mentioned that they'd done some simulations where you could lose 90% of the US population. Because you've so undermined infrastructure. So you can see, where there's a worry. And since then, they've been doing more and more protections for the grid. And now I don't know how far they've got, but I do know that people like the Electric Infrastructure Security Council are doing two things. They're saying to government and they're saying to the utility providers in the US, folks, you've got to be better prepared, you've got to harden your systems, you've got to be resilient to this type of shock. However, they're also saying to society, if a shock like this does happen, then society has to be better prepared and resilient. So, you stop it happening, ideally, through diplomacy or whatever else. There's nothing we can do if there's a severe solar flare. That's beyond our ken to do anything about becoming it, but we can be more resilient to it hits. But if you lose resilience, then the next step is, well, what does society do? How can it be more resilient? So they're working on both of those. But you know, the thing about it is really, I think if you thought of something like a solar flare, even rather, because a solar flare would be happen over a fair bit of the globe, yeah, which would fry things. We're so interdependent that you know, let's just say a part of the US, northeast US, just picking a random region, it's connected to everything else. It's not like it can work. It's not like everywhere else can have no infrastructure, and the northeastern United States is happily working along as normal. We see this with the coronavirus and its impacts. We're connected. So, you know, if you hit anywhere for any reason, any part of the global economy, we're so connected, it's going to have impacts. And this was, I think, related to a question Lorraine Hussey was asking about the US centrality to the global economy in a time of coronavirus, and sort of say, does this mean it's a higher global systemic risk? And you know, she used the idea of a blood clot in the heart, and I totally concur with her. So you have in network science, there's something that they call centrality of a network or of a system, and that's really what that network's measure of that network's criticality to all of the other parts of the network outside it. So, for example, you know, the US has exceedingly high centrality to the global system. So if we turned off the US, the rest of the global economy would collapse, because there's, you know, the financial systems would fall apart, no input of goods from their communications network, you know what I mean? Everything would go down. So it is like the heart, it has a high centrality. And if you have a country like Ireland, you know, in a more interdependent global economy, actually now Ireland would have much lower centrality, but still would have a critical role for, in terms of economic shock, supplies of, you know, pharmaceuticals, medical things, etc. So there is this idea of centrality. And in a real sense, everything is now connected. So even if you're a small country or a small town and you have a big enough shock, some way it'll ripple out. But, you know, as I say, in the case of the US, it'll be a heart attack that would kill the patient. But, you know, if it was Germany, it would probably be liver failure. And if it was Ireland, it might be you've just had a really bad trauma to your leg or something like that, you know, in relative terms to their effect on the global system. And if you're, you know, I think just because I know it, if you're in Kyrgyzstan and there's a, you know, it'll have minimal effect globally. But one of the interesting things about that is, you know, if there's a global systems failure, Kyrgyzstan in some ways might be more resilient than we are, because it's low centrality to the global system, because we don't rely on very much from Kyrgyzstan, the rest of the system, but also it's kind of a measure of its relative, not a perfect measure, but it's a measure of its national resilience. In other words, if you're not so interconnected, you've had to be more adaptive to relying on yourself. Now, it would still be a huge trauma to, you know, Kyrgyzstan, but you know, more people produce food using less inputs there, for example, and that sort of thing. So that's just the thing of centrality. So this is the thing even about preparedness for EMP attacks or whatever is, you can be prepared, but if everybody else isn't prepared and they're hit, we're so interconnected, it's still going to hit you. We don't know, it depends how hard it's going to hit you, about the centrality of where it happens. So that becomes a problem. You know, even, you know, it's kind of a case where you need, for a major solar global solar storm hitting, where it's not a, assuming we're not doing EMP attacks all around the world, but solar storm will take a big part of the world. If only a little part of it has had a chance to be prepared in terms of hardening systems, then you're still vulnerable to the weakest link of all of those who haven't been prepared. Now, I think there's all sorts of ways to be prepared. So I think one might be, for example, because you have some time to, because people are looking at the sun, and they can probably see there's a solar flare coming. We've got X amount of minutes. So, I don't know if there's a system where around the world they tell everybody, shut down your networks now, so that to give it some level of protection. But on the side of preparedness for all of this, the side of preparedness for an EMP, for this sort of hardening system, it is happening, absolutely. And there has been discussion for, I think the first report was 2004, so 16 years. But I don't think there's the confidence to say that as a society we're prepared. So, because resilience is a multi-level thing. So there's more preparedness by the infrastructure people. But if the infrastructure systems still fail, because some parts fail, causing others, so if you're not fully prepared, or just whatever it is so bad, things are fried anyway, or it hits a part of the network that you never thought of before. You were thinking of transformers and it hits some other sort of part of things, some control systems or whatever. We don't know. There's always a risk there, but if that fails, it's onto society. And I think that's a question that kind of links to pandemics. Because if you have any big shock that's big enough, you'll take down interdependent systems. So if I wanted to kill the financial system, one way of doing it is to kill the grid. If I wanted to kill the grid, one way of doing it is to collapse the financial system. Because you won't, it'll take a little bit longer, but you won't be able to get inputs, parts, etc., upgrades, fuels, all of the other things. And, a proper financial collapse so that nobody knows what money is worth. There's no transactions. Or if I wanted to cause the failure of either of those two, I could just say, well, I'm going to shut the flow of goods and services from a critical area, etc., etc. So all that means is the systems are interdependent. You lose one, you lose the other, or you lose this sort of network of critical services. So what that kind of means, though, is any shock, if it's big enough, or combinations of shocks, if it takes down the whole system, it could be due to a pandemic. So we've had a pretty light to medium pandemic at the moment is what we're experiencing. But if it was a severe pandemic, if it was a financial system collapse because of limits to growth, if it was a severe solar storm, they would all have ultimately the same outcome. And the outcome would be a shutdown in the flow of goods and services. And that's the simplest way of sort of saying what a collapse is. Shut down in the flow of goods and services. And, if you want to prepare, so rather than saying, at the bottom level of the societal level of resilience and preparedness, you don't say, oh my, we've got to plan for a major pandemic, severe pandemic, and we've got to do another plan for a major financial system collapse, and we've got to do another plan for some combinations of effects that we may not even be able to imagine at any time. You can say, well, if the outcome is the same, this is for severe systemic collapse. Well, then you actually it's very simple. You prepare for the shutdown of the flow of goods and services, and therefore you're prepared for all sorts of eventualities. And even though that sort of thing is can be scary, it does give you a place to work from. And it does mean you can stop focusing on the cause, which kind of obsesses people, and sort of say, okay, how do we build societies that are better able to deal with that sort of shock? And how do we, what's important? We know food, we know water, we know shelter, we know social peace, stroke governance, we know healthcare, basic healthcare. I mean, obviously with these sort of things, you're not going to be doing heart surgery, but basic public health. So and how do we organize ourselves so that we can work cooperatively rather than and be robust to predatory forces, if that's the word, taking advantage of the situation. But that's the extreme end of things. But I think there's in between parts that if we think more about what the shutdown and flow of goods and services mean, we start to think of food security. And if we start to think of food security and why the shutdown of flows of goods and services is important, because it's not just I don't have food because my money doesn't work or because the supermarket and supply chains aren't working. It's the farmer saying, well, I need fertilizers, or I need pesticides, or I need seeds, and I don't have a tractor. Can't run my tractor because I can't get diesel. So you sort of see that holistic way of what that means. And then you can start to sort of say, from my perspective, now you kind of say, well, if we're in a world that's becoming more volatile, how would we use that volatility to sort of say, how do we deal better with those sort of food shocks at the same time as sort of responding to the crisis that we're in now? So, I've seen, that can also solve problems. So I think, I think I might have mentioned before that, I think one of the great things that we should be doing at the moment, but it needs support and all of that, is urban food growing. But food growing like we mean it, rather than food growing so that you can kind of come in and say, look, I grew a lettuce on a box. I bought the seeds, haven't I? Great. But really sort of food growing and seeing what we can do that. I know places like, I think there was something in Sheffield that they did some work on that in the UK, and really showed they could produce, I think it was something like 30% of vegetables within the city, which is pretty significant, in terms of food security. So all of these things can be prepared, but we're a long way from it. It's easier if you're a government and I'm an infrastructure company, it's much easier to get me to prepare to be more robust to solar flare than it is to get society to be prepared for, a failure of the grid.
Well, you brought up a lot of thoughts there, David.
Yeah.
And so I think I'll just reflect, and I think you'll be able to ping right off of that. I mean, one of the things I was thinking about was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union stopped providing goods and services to Cuba and also to, I believe, North Korea. And they responded differently to that. I think a lot of it had to do with geography, that North Korea has a winter, whereas Cuba does not. And so Cuba started to grow food like their lives depended upon that, using permaculture techniques, growing vegetables everywhere. I mean, in boxes outside of windows in Havana and in vacant lots and on rooftops. And the tractors didn't have any fuel, so the land was parceled out into like vegetable garden size, small plots, maybe 100 meters by 100 meters, small, and people would grow the food on those. And it was very it was not necessarily super smooth. People lost an average of 20 or 30 pounds during this special period where they were attempting to grow food like crazy, but they were in a place where they were able to grow food year round. Whereas North Korea, which is much more northerly, and they have a winter, you know, the general story I've heard is that they had a massive famine, and many people, millions of people died in the immediate after effect of the inability to get imports from Russia, from the former Soviet Union. So I think that was one thought I had. Another thought was, as far as which countries or which communities are well prepared at the moment, you know, what sort of mindset or worldview or life stance or economic system or political system, and you kind of touched on this earlier, that kind of command economies seem to be very effective during the pandemic, which are generally called communist systems, I guess you could say. But New Zealand is a very socialist system, but then that's an island nation, so that's different. Hawaii did the same thing. They're an island, and they were able to say anybody who comes in is quarantining for 14 days, and so people stopped traveling there. And but Japan, on the other hand, I don't know much about.
No, I don't think it. I think it's sort of middle of the road. I mean, the good one. Like, I mean, when I think of the good ones, I kind of think of Taiwan, South Korea, New Zealand, Germany. So they're all pretty, you know, in US terms, they'd be a little bit left wing, but from European terms, not so much. So, you know, I think now obviously China did a job, and I think China was the coercive one in that, yeah, it is an increasingly even more authoritarian. But I think, you know, I'm not sure how much the authoritarian democratic. I mean, I think things like social trust, competence, some preparedness and planning. In other words, you recognize as an issue, a risk, and you're going to go out and do something to respond, to think about it, are all good things.
This makes me concerned for the US in particular, because at the moment, it does not seem like our executive branch is really as effective at addressing issues as other countries, or even times in the US's past, like in the 40s, for example. In the 40s or late 30s, the executive branch, the government, the nation as a whole was able to respond quite quickly to the call to war for Europe and Asia, and was able to organize itself in such a way that, I mean, even though the public debt, the federal government's debt, so to speak, went way up, almost everyone was employed. Like all four of my grandparents were employed in the war effort. My grandfather on one side was in the Navy. His wife was at university and then was doing something with like the Red Cross, his future wife. And my other grandfather was in Africa, and his future wife was working in Detroit on building, you know, airplane motors or something. And everybody was very well organized. At the moment, the US, though, it concerns me, this whole idea of the US has been slow, so it feels ineffective at addressing this pandemic, even though they seemed like they knew it was a concern, but that didn't translate to actually being prepared. And you're talking about the EMP, the US is aware of it, certainly, but is it actually prepared? I mean, for example, in Michigan, telling one of our large electric utilities, you need to prepare your transformers by hardening them. well, this is a corporate decision based on share prices. And are we actually going, you know, what's the risk of this? And are we going to actually invest money in this? You know, and it's not like I haven't heard of like massive billion-dollar grants going out to the utility companies that say this money can only be spent on, you know, hardening your transformers by putting them in lead boxes or whatever it would take to harden them, you know, or that we're going to buy 10,000 of these large transformers and we're going to, you know, stash them around the country or something like that. So even though the US is maybe aware on kind of like the intellectual level, I mean, just like I'm aware that I really would like to have a huge food forest outside my house. You know, I have enough space that we could probably provide for my family of 4, but we don't. I mean, we have more than a lot of people do, but we're not anywhere near like being able to live off the land here, you know?
Yeah.
So what are your reflections on that, or does it go back to what you
well,
said?
no, I think as I said, I think stuff is being done in the US about it. I don't know how far advanced it is, and I don't know how much available information there is. So it's a thing I keep an eye on occasion. And I know some of the Electric Infrastructure Security Council people because they're now expanded beyond grid failing to broad societal shocks of all sorts. So you can see why we have a shared interest there. So, but again, if the central question, coming back to that one about the US, is a governance and a social trust, ability of society to bury their differences. And usually you'll find, you know, where there is some level of social trust, you'll find when the government, whoever the government are in power, will say, now we have a crisis, this is what it is, this is what we need to do. And you'll find that most opposition parties and countries will say, okay, we understand this is a crisis. We're not just going to attack the government all the time, willy-nilly, like we normally do, because we
like what happened after 9/11, for example.
Yes, that's probably good. You get some sort of things of, you know, we're not just going to go on the normal attack. Now, that's, you know, what if there is a base level of trust in society, and even though you can have, you know, there's always political differences and social differences, big thing comes, people kind of go, okay, we realize this is a collective risk, so we're going to work together, be supportive, etc. Now, what happens in the US, as I see from a distance, is that the US has already been fracturing, deeply fracturing. And the US, the current US administration, is by any standards appallingly narcissistic, ineffectual, self-centered, etc. Now, you may have people out there who think they're great, but no one really thinks that they've done this sterling response to the coronavirus. And, you know, I understand that within states, there's been some really good collaboration. So the states, because obviously they have capacities and controls, have been pretty good in some cases, very good in others. But the dysfunction at the top and the divisions, the idea that something like mask wearing becomes a totemic thing to prove your loyalty is really dangerous. Or that taking a drug because your leader said it's good, I take it all the time, I've even put money into it as far as I understand. You know, take it, you know, people going, this has no effect, but people are going, yes, we'll take it because we support him. That sort of, if your message starts to become tribalized like that, you're already losing the game. And it's what's more is, you know, again, you know, I'm not an expert. What I can see is that 40+ million people have lost their jobs. The social welfare net in the US is not particularly good from a European's eyes. The healthcare system, if you don't have money and can't lose jobs, becomes pretty hardcore. And the payments that are should be coming from government that have been done in many other countries, where straight away you're pumping money in. Now you're pumping money in, both firstly to help people, because if you've lost jobs and all of this sort of thing, it's a big shock. You want to help people so they can pay their bills, pay for food, feel secure. They've enough to worry about without giving them like fear of being absolutely broke and not being able to feed the kids. That the transmission mechanisms for all of that. Firstly, there's should we do it? And it's been pretty skimpy and hard to, you know, they haven't given very much, 600 here, 1,200, etc. You know, really, and the, you know, people were waiting for weeks, and I think some are still waiting. That's a, you know, most countries have got this sort of transmission mechanism within a week or two. You know, it was pretty simple. They were just get money to people, and it also helps the economy. It keeps the thing ticking over. So it's very clear that there's a part of the American population who've been left very vulnerable, and we know many of them are, more of them are minorities, etc. But we know that this is a real systemic failing of the political system, not the preparedness system in a sense of what you would have prepared in scenario planning and exercises and all of that over the years. It's a failure of politics. It's a failure of people in government to support the idea that there is a collective we that is bigger than the divisions. And, you know, rather than trying to bring that together, which is what a good, not even a good leader, just a basically competent leader that wasn't in such a divisive system would do, is people would work together. It is, from what I can see, it's a mess. And if I was to look forward, I don't know what's going to happen. The federal level of government, there's great skills there, and I know there's lots of people there who are distraught by this, who've been trying to do their best and all of that sort of thing. And it's a tragedy for them, for all of the people who want to support and reach out to their fellow citizens. But it does kind of make you think, well, if we're in a time now of growing risks, where is the level at which we should be pushing for preparedness and resilience? Because you can't assume the state will, or the federal side. What about the state? What about local? And it seems to me that, you know, if there's one side on preparedness, we have to start all thinking that preparedness is something we do throughout society. We don't have this assumption that somewhere within the federal government are people who are planning for catastrophes, and when catastrophes come, they'll make it all right. There probably are people doing that, but we don't know the transmission mechanism and how effective it will be. These things need to be right throughout, from your local village to the federal government. And the other thing is, and hopefully this will happen with, is, you know, you need to work towards finding a large middle ground that people can disagree and yet kind of work with the assumption that I may disagree with you, but that doesn't mean I think you're evil or bad. You know, we can still work together on things. And, you know, I'm not going to go out and hurt you because we have different opinions or whatever on something kind of trivial that, you know, you wear a mask, I don't. That's good enough reason to not like you. Yeah, that sort of thing is poisonous. but it's also, it really amplifies risk. And I think, this is one of those things about preparedness that's been really clear, that really come to the fore in this crisis, is, we are genuinely interdependent. Like, of all things, a pandemic is a real lesson in how, you don't manage your own risk, because, in one sense, the virus, the chance that you'll get a virus is all based on other people's decisions. And the chance that other people get a virus is also based on you. And that includes your loved ones and anything else. So, yes, you can live in a hole and eat out of tins and keep people away, but we don't live like that. So, it actually is one of those things that really emphasizes our interdependence. But I think that interdependence in a complex world is even more so. We can't feed ourselves. We don't know how do we get water? How do we do all of these things? How do we have a society so the strong don't prey on the weak? All of these things that are crucial in a crisis are kind of now predicated on us finding processes and systems to work together on. And maybe, just maybe, in this coming few years, that one of the things that could be a unifying force is, thinking of resilience and preparedness as a collective endeavor. So there's no such thing as Republican or Democrat resilience and preparedness. There is community resilience and preparedness. There is there is regional, et cetera, et cetera. But that does come with things such as the danger is that there could be local resilience, but those people over there don't get to access it. So if you're poor, or if you're a minority, or if you just are the wrong sort of people to people in power, you don't get it. But that's something to be cognizant of for everybody, that this works best when everybody's covered by it. It works better for risk as well. If I say, well, me and my gang are going to get the resources of this town if a crisis comes, well, I've just added immensely to my own gang's insecurity, because of all the other people who don't get it are going to be pretty annoyed. So what I'll be doing in a crisis, rather than saying, okay, how do we look after everybody, I'll be saying, okay, how do I look after my own gang? How do I protect what my group or my people want? And also, how do I protect myself from angry people who aren't in this in-group that I identify with? So in other words, suddenly already I've created a new source of, I must spend resources of whatever type on defense, on protection, on segregation, all of these things, that would actually be better put into resilience and preparedness in the crisis. So, that's, again, that sort of about being interdependent, about the importance of collective preparedness where everybody's part of it. And it's also a source of skills. It's not even that these things should be just top down, where, it's that, if you bring lots of people's diversity and skills together and say, look, we have a problem, we are vulnerable, or what do we do? Nobody has the golden answer. That's going to be discovered. You can learn things, but it's going to be discovered by communities. Your community knows about, will learn, even if they don't know, they will learn about what your community's needs are. I don't know what your soil is like for growing food. I don't know what your water system is like. That's only your community can do that. So maybe, if with all of the growing awareness of, the failure of politics, that's something like, in the best, societies have crises. question is, do you learn from them? What do you pick out of them? And if out of this, I mean, Hurricane Katrina was a disaster, but you notice the management of catastrophes got better, those sort of hurricane things, after, because they were learning. They realized, this is not what to do. Don't do this, do that. What do we learn? Do we absorb things? And so that's one side of things. So if one of the things you can learn in this crisis is why good, competent management is important, or at the political level, don't vote for people just because they hate your enemies with you. It's not a good reason to vote for somebody. It's dangerous. May kill you. The other thing is, yes, there'll be a narrative of lifting everybody up and getting the economy going again. But, in our world, we see an increasingly risky and dangerous world. So there needs to be also a sort of saying is, well, yeah, those people can try and pick up where we got off, but we've learned something else from the pandemic. We learned it's a sign of our vulnerability, and it's a sign of the growing risks we face, be it pandemics and viruses, or interactions and pushing on the Earth system, be it climate change, be it growing stress in the financial system, whatever. So those things can be used. Now, I hope somebody's doing that. I know somebody who's thinking about doing that. But, I mean, if to my mind, that's the biggest thing you could do at the moment. Anybody, anywhere, is say, the clock is ticking. How do we do resilience? How do we do it collectively? And part of that would be governance issues and all of that. So the question is, do we learn? And I don't know what's going to happen in the US election in November. Firstly, fingers crossed it happens, and we'll see after that.
So I think we should kind of wrap it up so the viewer has some sense of completeness. And before we started the call, I was mentioning Africa. So I have four new friends in Africa. I have one in Ghana, one in Burkina Faso, and then on the east side, I have a friend in Kenya and one in Uganda. And Uganda in particular, my friend there is attempting to, grow some food. He's got a garden, he's got some friends or neighbors or family that are helping him out, and he's got potatoes and yams growing, and he's trying to grow some bananas and whatnot. But for the people in the third world, or poor people as well, people who don't have, tons of money to just buy all the food they want from the grocery store or whatever. This idea of the possible, not likely, perhaps, collapse of the global economy, where there's not money coming in and out anymore. There's not goods, how did you put it, a shutdown of the flow of goods and services. What's a way for people there to prepare? Another complicating issue is that there was recently, a large rainstorm for a couple days. And so on the western side of Uganda, there's this mountainous region, and the water swept down the denuded hills onto the, the treeless, what used to be jungle, right? And just washed down this river valley and took away, some villages and many farm fields. And so now there are many people there whose livelihoods have been destroyed. So, what sort of things, as far as preparedness, can be translated to people who live in this sort of situation, and how can those of us who are concerned about the most vulnerable on the earth, like this, the children, and especially those that are in orphanages or whatnot, because it's all well and good for me to have, 2 weeks of food in the cupboard and a garden outside.
Yeah.
But, I'm relatively wealthy as far as the world is concerned, not as far as the US is concerned, but as far as the world is concerned.
Yeah.
So, but how do we help other people? I mean, I'm concerned about so many people,
Sure. Yeah, and I totally get this. And I think it's also, if things go wrong here, we will be in a catastrophic state in Europe or the United States. We will be starving, there will be famine, in the downers, if things really fail. So our idea of what we have now as wealth, I think, is relatively temporary. I think we're going, yes, there's an extreme thing of where everything goes down. There's an intermediate thing where we will be very hungry as well. So the first thing I want to get is, I want to get rid of the idea that our wealth somehow will always buy us a pass out of catastrophe. It won't. The second thing is, my feeling is that there are people who have lived very poorly in poorer countries, who've been doing it for years. They have more skills at dealing with crises, dealing with these sort of things than we have. It's not, we need to be learning from them. The whole development model is we go and I think it's totally turning. It should be the other way around now. If you want to get your fancy infrastructure built, yes, one side, but we're going into a world where, we need to learn. So here's a couple of things I think, just in the broad side of that. I would be, rather than having first world development people going over to places in Africa to improve their production and systems, I'd be much more interested in Western foundations paying African people with specialist skills in dealing with crises, response, food insecurity, how do you deal with volatility, all of these things. I'd be much more interested in them saying, here, we'll give you money, come and teach us something about what you're doing. You know what I mean? I think that's really important. I think, it would take a bit of foresight, and it would have to require us to get off our own pedestal about things, but, we're going there. The other thing is, I'd say, well, if, and this is how I got interested in a lot of these things, if you bring development into a country, but the development comes with creating new dependencies, be it on seeds, be it on international supply chains, that's only going to work. It's creating every new dependency is a new path of vulnerability as well. Not always. You want some connectivity for times because it, to deal with, localized disruptions of food and all of that. But it's important to remember. So, in the broad, I kind of really think, I'm reluctant to sort of say what to do, but I do think if you're a foundation, you might say, well, if we want foundational resilience and preparedness in African countries, or if the foundation does, kind of say, okay, if this sort of new reality was happening, you're not going to be rich. What's more is the West isn't going to be rich anymore. It's going to be struggling with things. And in future, it will not be able to, probably will not be giving you money or other things. It may not, it'll be dealing with its own issues. If you imagine you're in a narrowing window of time, what do you need in now from your own assessment of your needs, your community's needs, your towns, cities, countries' needs? What do you think, given this tightening frame, is the stuff that you would be most interested in to help you be more resilient? You're going to be the expert, or your communities or your town is going to have to find the expertise. You know it. You can learn about the various ideas that are important. Is there something that would be very useful, like kind of critical gaps that may be importing, you know, maybe a water system, more wells or something like that, that would help if they're robust or whatever. But that's how I'd look at it, you know, that and help, you know, what do people there need? Because I'm not sure. Yes, there's money, and yes, there's a discussion, a collective, two-way discussion to be had on what resilience and preparedness means, especially for big shocks. Because, you know, some of the discussion of resilience is, oh, we'll give people better seeds, but the seeds have to be bought, so you get this dependency on this monoculture of seeds, and it only works as long as there's a functioning economies and global integration. And as soon as that falls, you're left with nothing, because you don't have seeds to grow new things in. You've only had these fancy seeds. It was supposed to make you more resilient to one thing, but it's made you vulnerable to other things. So, you know, thinking through these, I really think, you know, if we can support with funds, if we can support, or if we can pressure foundations in developed countries to say, look, you know, you shouldn't be sending lots of us over to Africa. You should be helping, try and encourage some of them and pay them to come over to us and learn things, and then getting communities to do their own resilience and preparedness planning themselves and what they need. So, yeah.
Well, that's a good reflection. Thank you for sharing that, David.
Oh.
The little that I have been trying to do is just to support the 3 of the 4 people who I know in Africa are farmers, and so they've had, you know, just requests for, you know, to be able to buy some tools and some fertilizer and some seeds, and so I've said, you know, I can support you this much, but it's a one-time thing, and you know, but I hope you're moving towards saving your own seeds, and you know, making sure your water system is good, and growing some food growing trees. You know, I don't know where you live, but you know, it seems pretty clear to me that if there's no forest, then you're likely to be susceptible to droughts and to floods and to those sorts of things. So, but I appreciate your.
Yeah, I think things like tools are great, because, you know, they're physical repeat use things that will be needed, and like, you know, they're hard to make, you know, so, or at least for ordinary people, if you don't have a factory that makes them, they're hard to make. So those sort of things, I think that's great. I mean, that's quite specific.
All right. So as we wrap up, first of all, a mention to the viewers, this channel, the Local Future channel on YouTube, has all sorts of videos that talk about preparedness. They talk about, you know, the risks that we're facing right now in 2020 and beyond. They also talk about resilience and preparedness and assessing risks and things like that. And David and I have had 4 or 5 conversations, I think. So if you'd like to hear more from David, actually the conversation prior to this one, David gives a very nice presentation with slides and everything. It's about a 50-minute presentation. So I highly recommend that, because this is kind of a follow-up to that. Also, David, do you want to just say a little bit about where can people learn more about either you or preparedness?
Yeah. Well, for me, you can find my own website. Now it's a work website, so it's not full of, you'll find papers there and that ever, but it's not full of bells and whistles and happening stuff. It's, in one word, Korowicz human systems. So Korowicz, Korowicz, human, HUMAN, systems, systems.com. It's all one word. So if you look there, you'll find things. You know, I know you have resources, but I mean, there's all sorts. You know, for background things, I think resilience.org, there's always articles there that about our predicament and perspectives on it. But I think Aaron, you know, you'll have a far better list than I will, I'd say, for.
And again, for the viewers, if you appreciate content like this, notice this was an uncut conversation, long form. You could listen to this if you have your YouTube audio app or whatever. If you hit thumbs up, that would be appreciated, and subscribe and put your email in so you get notifications. And if you have questions, especially for David, put them in the comments, or if you just have a comment or reflection, feel free to do that. Any final thoughts for today, David? First of all, I really appreciate your time, again, all the way from Ireland in, you know, the middle of June. But any departing thoughts or reflections?
No, just whoever's out there, wishing you well. Look after yourselves and your loved ones, and be nice to yourselves and each other. You know, it's important, you know, especially in this time when things are a bit crazy, that we get off our screens and, you know, find good, nurturing things to do.
All right. Thank you so much, David. And
Thanks,
we will talk to you again, I'm sure. Bye-bye.
All the best. Bye now.